A deaf-mute woman is arrested by the police and accused of trafficking illegal substances. But everything changes because of one sentence spoken by her 10-year-old son. Let's discover what happened to Elena and her son in this story. The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to dry the dew when the road behind them began to grumble. Elena Carter walked steadily, one hand wrapped around her son's smaller one. The red clay path still held the night's chill, and the soft crunch of gravel under their worn shoes was the only sound between them. Micah, all elbows and knobby knees at 10 years old, wore his backpack like armor. His curls bounced with each step, his free hand sketching invisible lines in the morning air dragons, he'd say if asked. But today, like most days, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. They turned a corner near the hollow where the old church bell hadn't rung in years, and Elena tilted her face toward the warmth beginning to press through the mist. Her thick hair, still damp at the nape, clung to her skin. She breathed in the scent of pine sap and rust. A dog barked 2 streets over. A screen door slammed. These were sounds she could not hear, but she knew them by rhythm, by the slight tug on her son's hand, by the echo in his body language. Then the shriek of a horn, the shatter of peace. Micah flinched. A patrol car whipped past them, kicking up a storm of grit and yellow dust. It stopped sharp just ahead. Both doors opened in sync like a ceremony. 2 officers stepped out, pressed uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, tight jaws. Elena halted mid-step. Her grip on Micah's hand stiffened. She looked to him, her brows raised just slightly, a question with no sound. He didn't answer, just stared at the men the way children do when something too big to name starts to crawl under their skin. "Mrs. Elena Carter," one officer barked, voice flat as iron. "You are under arrest." Micah blinked. What Elena's body didn't move, not forward, not back. Her eyes flicked from the officer's mouth to his hands. The words, she understood them. She knew that sentence. She'd read it before in courtroom shows with subtitles in the corners of bad dreams. The other officer circled behind her, and her mouth opened, not in speech but in reflex, as if trying to breathe through a tide rising too fast. Her hand, still clutching Micah's, trembled, then loosened. She reached for her chest, signing quick, sharp, "What is this? Why my son?" But they didn't look. They didn't respond. Micah stepped in front of her. "Wait. What's going on?" She didn't do anything. His voice cracked at the edges. "Mom." The taller officer took her wrists, pulled them gently but without hesitation. He didn't meet her eyes. Micah lunged, gripping her arm. "She didn't do anything wrong," he cried. "Mom, say something." But she couldn't. And in the worst way that was saying something. She tried again, signed slow this time, wide gestures like she was underwater. "My son, please. I need him safe." Her eyes begged where her voice could not go. But the crowd had started to gather. 2 men from the bakery, Mrs. Hall from the post office, faces familiar but blank. Some mouths hung open. None spoke. Not really. The cuffs clinked like chains in a church pew. Micah screamed, loud, ragged heartbreak pouring out in a child's fury. "Mom. Let go. Mom." She didn't resist. She couldn't. Not with him watching. They pushed her into the car, one officer holding her head low as if she were violent. Her knees scraped the metal edge of the seat. She flinched, but made no sound, just stared back through the glass at her son, who now fought the grip of a social worker's hand like a dog caught in barbed wire. Elena turned her face to him, pressed her forehead to the window. Her eyes, still wet bright, met his, and even through the blur of panic, the boy seemed to understand she was telling him not to be afraid, to wait, to watch. But the car drove off with a low, rumbling moan. The dust settled behind them like smoke. A week before the arrest, the town still breathed in its slow, sunlit rhythm. Mornings came with the smell of frying bacon drifting across clapboard porches, and the cicadas hadn't yet begun their summer scream. Elena Carter arrived before sunrise each day, unlocking the side door of the roadside diner with a practiced twist, her fingers stiff from the morning chill and years of repetition. The mop handle, slightly splintered where it rubbed her palm, felt oddly reassuring. One of those small discomforts she'd grown to expect, like the sideways looks or the silence that followed her presence. Inside the floor held a thin film of dust and old grease. She raked the broom in long, even strokes, pausing only to tuck back the loose strands of hair that clung to her face. The radio behind the counter played low country ballads mostly. Elena couldn't hear it, but she knew the cadence. She'd seen the waitress Marlene mouthing along to every chorus without thinking. For a long time, Elena could read the lips of people in front of her. She thought it was an adaptation, but it could also be a small talent making up for her shortcomings. Sometimes Marlene spoke to her, not with much interest, but with a kind of duty. Slow sentences, drawn-out words like Elena was elderly or foreign. Elena didn't correct her. She only nodded, met her eyes, smiled small. That smile had become her shield, not warmth, not apology, just a boundary she could carry. Customers trickled in by 7. The regulars gave small nods, some not at all. Elena moved around them like smoke, wiping down tables, refilling sugar jars, lifting chairs to sweep beneath. She wasn't invisible, but she wasn't quite seen either. In the corner booth, Micah sat cross-legged on the cracked vinyl bench, his sketch pad propped against his knees. He was drawing a tall woman in armor standing silent before a courthouse. Her hands were bound, but her eyes were fire. Above her head, in his uneven scrawl, he'd written, "The Silent Warrior." He looked up every few minutes, watching his mother squinting to catch her gestures. A slight tightening of her jaw, a slower sweep of her rag through spilled coffee, that was enough. He knew when she was tired, when she was tense. Words were never their currency. During breaks, Elena would sit across from him, fingers moving gently in the air. "Are you hungry?" She'd sign, tapping her chin, then miming a bite. Micah would nod or shake his head or sign back. "I'm drawing the trial." He didn't need to explain which trial. He meant the one in his head, the one where his mother always won. On Wednesdays and Sundays, Elena walked the 5 blocks to the small white church with the peeling cross. She carried 2 canvas bags filled with canned soap and old coats. She never rang the bell. She just entered, nodding politely to the deacon if he was there, and began sorting packages. She liked the order of it. Rows of peanut butter jars, stacks of notebooks, paper slips with scribbled names. She filled out forms for the elderly who couldn't write handed bags to mothers with too many children. Sometimes they'd thank her with their eyes. Sometimes they wouldn't look at all. Elena didn't ask for anything. Her gift wasn't for show. The church's back room held a bulletin board with yellowing photos, children's choir food drives, summer fairs. In one picture, she stood off to the side, half in shadow, her hand on Micah's shoulder. No one had asked to take it, but someone had wanted proof that she was there. That evening, as the sun fell low and red over the pine trees, Elena and Micah walked home. The red dirt road glowed amber under their steps. Their shadows stretched long behind them, almost touching the tire tracks carved deep into the ground. Micah hummed softly. Not music, but rhythm. A beat he made with his feet slapping the side of his shoe against his ankle as he walked. Elena smiled at that. She reached out, took his hand. He looked up at her. "They said Missy's mom is going to buy her a phone," he said. "If I had one, I could, message you." She smiled again, slower this time, then signed, "We're together now." He nodded, though a sliver of doubt passed behind his eyes. "But what if something happens?" he asked, barely louder than the wind brushing through the dry grass. She paused, stopped walking, crouched beside him, pressing both hands to his cheeks gently like she was sculpting something delicate. Her eyes searched his. Then she signed, "Look at me." Micah blinked. Nothing will happen. That's what she thought at the time. But what was happening now made Elena feel like she had been doused with a bucket of ice-cold water. Elena sat on a narrow cot, ankles crossed, hands folded tight in her lap. The cell was colder than it looked, its white walls carrying the chill of something deeper than concrete. Light buzzed from a ceiling fixture, casting a sterile glare that flattened everything into shadowless gray. Time had stopped moving in hours now. It simply hung stale and unkind. There were no visitors, no calls. The guards didn't speak unless necessary, and even then they used clipped phrases, eyes elsewhere. Her name wasn't spoken. She was now the suspect. A paper form, a case number, a charge. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances across state lines, possession with intent, tampering with charitable records. The words were read to her slowly, over-enunciated, as if repetition could make them true. She watched the lips of the man who delivered the news, his jaw clenched too tight, his eyes skimming over her like she wasn't there. She signed back, deliberate and controlled. "I don't understand. This isn't mine. I never touched any of that." No reply, just a shrug and the click of a door closing. They had her signature. That was enough. Forms she'd filled for shipments at the church. Boxes she'd moved, labeled, sorted. Her name printed beneath rows of inventory logs, items she never questioned because trust was her way of staying afloat. That trust had become rope now looped tight and legal around her neck. In the town's eyes, the facts aligned. A woman on the margins. No voice. No husband. A child. It didn't take much. People preferred explanations that were easy to swallow, and Elena, in their view, was too quiet to be innocent. Micah's new room smelled of bleach and plastic. The bedspread was stiff, printed with a pattern of cartoon stars that felt wrong, childish in a way that mocked him. The window didn't open. The door locked from the outside. He didn't cry the first night. He just lay there, eyes wide, hand curled around the embroidered handkerchief he'd hidden in his sock. The threads had loosened near the edge. He ran his thumb across them until sleep dragged him under. No one asked if he was hungry. No one asked why he didn't speak. The workers called him sweetheart in passing, but never stopped long enough to notice he answered with his hands. When he signed water or bathroom, they stared, then guessed. He stopped signing after that. Instead, he drifted. Sat at the edge of group activities without joining. Ate only when hunger twisted too tight. Waited. Always waited. For a knock, a word, a sign that someone was coming for him. It never came. A week passed in fragments, meals, quiet lights out. Then, on a late afternoon, heavy with heat and the hum of cicadas outside the facility's sealed windows, a woman with tired eyes called his name. Micah Carter. "You'll be transferring today." He rose without asking where. The bank's house was wedged between two faded duplexes on the edge of town. It looked like it had once tried to be cheerful, peach-colored paint, now cracked and peeling. A porch swing rusted at the chain. Inside, wires snaked across the floor like vines. Monitors blinked from a cluttered corner table. Micah stepped carefully around a pile of soldering tools, clutching his small backpack like armor. Jordan Banks looked up once from his desk, 17 sharp-shouldered with deep shadows under his eyes. His nod was not unkind, just brief. "Room's down the hall," he said, already turning back to his screen. Micah didn't speak, just followed. His room was narrow, clean, and quiet. No decorations, no smell. A bed, a desk, a window facing a brick wall. He placed the handkerchief under his pillow and lay down without unpacking. At dinner, Jordan's mother spoke mostly to herself, apologizing for the mess, asking if he liked spaghetti. Micah nodded once. She smiled tightly but didn't push. Jordan ate fast, wiped his mouth, and disappeared into his room. Micah sat at the table a moment longer, watching the soft flicker of the ceiling light on the walls. That evening, as the sky melted into orange and gold, Micah found a seat on the windowsill. He pulled his knees to his chest, resting his chin on the edge. The rooftop across the way was lined with moss and broken tiles. A single crow paced along the ridge, then took off with a flap that startled the air. Micah thought of his mother, her forehead pressed against the car window, her eyes on him. He'd seen something in them, not fear, not even sorrow, something quieter, heavier. Watch, they had said. He remembered the truck, the man unloading crates behind the church, the way no one looked too closely. In the silence of Jordan's house, the thought uncurled slowly inside him. If no one was listening, he would find another way to speak. He was only a child, but even small hands could dig. The house breathed differently at night. Old wood settled with reluctant sighs. The refrigerator ticked in the kitchen like an anxious clock. But the silence, thick and unsweetened, sat everywhere. Micah hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Not aloud, not in signs. He slept curled at the edge of the narrow bed the blanket barely pulled. Most nights he didn't sleep at all. In the moonlight, he traced the threads of the handkerchief tucked beneath his pillow. His fingers moved slowly, not for comfort, but for memory. Each loop of blue thread stitched into the corner was a piece of his mother's quiet world. A leaf, a line, a letter E, not even finished. He pressed it to his cheek, eyes dry but heavy. Down the hall, Jordan's door stayed shut. Music never played. Phone calls didn't happen. The boy barely spoke to his mother, and when he did, his words were flat-tired at the edges. Micah understood that kind of silence. It wasn't like his mother's gentle, necessary, shaped by love. Jordan's silence had sharper corners. It said, "Don't come closer." Still, Micah noticed the things Jordan didn't hide: the mess of circuit boards, the labeled bags of wires, the stack of books with dog-eared pages about networks and encryption. On the wall above his desk hung a whiteboard full of scribbles, arrows, diagrams, something secret but unfinished. Micah watched all this without entering. Until that morning. Jordan had gone out, said something about a parts run, maybe a pawn shop. The front door clicked shut behind him, and Micah stood in the hall barefoot and unsure. He hesitated at the threshold of Jordan's room, then stepped in. The computer screen glowed like a portal. Lines of code crawled across the display, green on black, moving in bursts, pausing, then shifting again. The room hummed low, warm with machine breath. Micah crept closer, drawn not by understanding but by instinct. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew the feeling. It was the same feeling he had when his mother handed him a folded note pressed into his palm, with a look that said more than ink could carry. "This matters." He touched the edge of the desk, eyes darting across the screen. Words he couldn't read, symbols he didn't recognize. but the patterns they felt alive like a secret language that waited for someone willing to listen. A drawer sat half open. Inside, a flash drive, a badge, a torn photo of Jordan, and a man with the same sharp jaw, his father maybe. Something distant in the smile. Micah sat on the floor back against the dresser, hand around his knees. That's where Jordan found him. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just stopped in the doorway. Micah looked up, bracing for the drop, but it never came. Jordan stepped inside and leaned against the wall. His arms crossed his face, unreadable. "Didn't think you were the curious type," he said after a long moment. Micah didn't answer. He couldn't. Jordan glanced at the screen, then back at the boy. "That's not a toy, you know." Micah nodded. They stayed there a while, silence spreading between them like slow water. Jordan knelt eventually, not too close. "I know what it's like," he said. "People making up their minds before you even say a word." Micah tilted his head. Jordan gestured, small, unsure. "Are you scared?" Micah blinked, then slowly raised both hands. "Not of you." Jordan nodded once, then looked away. That night, something changed. Jordan booted up a different system, quieter, older. He cleared a space on the desk. "Come here," he muttered. Micah hovered near, breath held. On screen, Jordan pulled up archived surveillance footage, angled views from street corners, church gates, grainy but steady. Local feed, he explained, though he wasn't sure if Micah could follow. The boy leaned in, eyes locked. Frame by frame, the church came into view. A familiar corner, a parking lot. Then there. Micah's finger jabbed the screen. "Here," Jordan asked. Micah nodded, pressed again. A truck, dark green, its plates coated in dirt. A man in a hoodie unloading boxes. One slipped, fell cracked open, something wrapped in gray foil. Jordan hit pause. Rewound. Played it again. Micah's breath hitched. Jordan didn't speak for a long while. Then, "That's not supposed to be there." Micah's eyes didn't leave the screen. Jordan sat back, ran a hand over his scalp. "Okay," he said. Not to the boy, not even to himself. More like to the room. The glow of the monitor lit both their faces, shadows dancing on the walls. Neither one knew the next step, but they both knew now they were in it together. By the second night, the air in Jordan's room smelled of solder smoke and sleeplessness. The hum of the tower fan pressed against the window screen, fighting the May heat that crept in like a thief. Jordan leaned over his keyboard, his fingers flying with the kind of silent fury that came from knowing you had no backup and no margin for error. Micah sat beside him, legs folded beneath him, face too still for a child. His eyes tracked every image, every frame, as if learning to read all over again, this time in the language of light and shadow. A pause. A rewind. Jordan pointed at the screen. "There," he said low. "Tattoo. Right forearm." Micah leaned in. The man stepping out of the truck wore a sleeveless flannel, the ink barely visible in the grainy frame, a serpent coiled around a cross. The boy blinked slowly, then signed, "I saw that before," where Jordan asked. Micah tapped his temple. "You sure?" The boy's hand closed around his mother's handkerchief in his lap. "Yes." They built a list. Tattoo. Late-night delivery, non-local plates. The truck's route cut against town traffic, moving in after hours, slipping away before dawn. Jordan, eyes rimmed, red-sketched timelines across the whiteboard. He traced lines through street cams, overlapping data with shipping logs he scraped from a forgotten city server, one that never got the memo about proper firewall protection. Each day, Micah brought more details from memory. a glint of chrome under the truck's back tire, a man wearing gloves in July, a receipt dropped outside the church, too clean, too folded. Jordan was meticulous. He cross-checked every detail, teaching Micah as he went, not with instruction, but through rhythm. They sat side by side, heads tilted the same way, breath held at the same intervals. 3 days in the drone came out. They waited until the morning fog clung to the fields like breath on glass. Jordan launched it from the porch roof while Micah held the monitor steady. The drone buzzed low, darting above the tree line, then curved toward the abandoned warehouse by the rail spur where no shipments had officially come through in 6 years. The footage told a quieter story. A white panel van backed in at 3:42 a.m. A man with a limp hauled out crates wrapped in black tarp. 2 others followed, one tall, wearing a church volunteer badge turned inside out. The drone captured everything from above, the motion eerie in the half-light like a ritual too practiced to be honest. Micah pressed pause. The warehouse cracked, and leaning no longer looked like an old building. It looked like a lid, like something hiding the smell of rot. Jordan glanced sideways. "You scared?" Micah shook his head, but his fingers tightened on the monitor. They kept digging. In an old government archive buried under forms no one had bothered to encrypt, Jordan found a cache of financial audits linked to a non-profit grant, Hands for Grace. The name rang a bell not because of what it said, but where it pointed. He opened a PDF, then another, then a folder full of scanned receipts and meeting minutes. On the 5th document, Micah leaned in. The church's address, Elena's name, her signature familiar, now painfully so, at the bottom of a shipment form, tied to a box that had never made it to its listed destination. Jordan clicked through 3 more files. Patterns formed. Amounts too even. Descriptions too vague. Phrases like outreach material and donation transport repeated across falsified invoices. Some were signed by names Jordan traced back to shell identities. Others had been scrubbed, only traces left like footsteps in dry mud. "This is deliberate," Jordan said, voice thin. Micah nodded once. They sat without speaking. The only sound was the fan blade stuttering in its casing. Eventually, Jordan clicked to full screen. On the monitor, they pulled up the church's volunteer roster from 2 years prior. There he was, the man with the tattoo. Officially listed as a logistics assistant. Unofficially, he'd disappeared after a brief police investigation into charity mismanagement file closed due to lack of evidence. And behind all of it, paper trails looped like rope around one constant location, the church's storage room. Micah stood behind Jordan, one hand resting on the older boy's sleeve. Neither of them moved. They didn't need to speak. They knew the line they'd just crossed. What had started as curiosity had grown teeth. The truth, once scattered, had started to take shape, and it was uglier than either of them had imagined. By morning, the world outside seemed unchanged. Breeze bending the grass, a dog barking 2 blocks down, but inside the bank's house, the air had shifted. It held a thickness now, like the pause before a storm, or the moment before a door opens onto something irreversible. Jordan leaned back in his chair, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His skin felt tight, jaw stiff from clenching all night. On the screen in front of him, file names, timestamps, metadata, everything strung together like a spider's web. Evidence, yes, but evidence alone was fragile. Paper burned. Footage disappeared. He needed someone who could make the system listen. Not a teacher, not a neighbor. Gina. She wasn't just family, she was once the town's loudest voice for fairness. His mother's younger sister. A defense attorney who'd made her exit from this place 5 years ago after a scandal she'd refused to cover up. She hadn't come back since, but she still returned calls, at least to Jordan. He typed the message slowly, careful with every word, then zipped the folder, 23 gigabytes of video spreadsheets, drone footage, financial records, and encrypted it. He hit send with a tight breath, then added a final line, "If you ever believed in justice, now's the time." The reply came 3 hours later. "I'm coming." 3 days later, they met at a coffee shop on the far edge of town. The kind of place with mismatched mugs and chipped linoleum, the air always smelling faintly of burnt toast. Gina arrived in a navy raincoat despite the dry heat. She wore no makeup, hair pulled back, a legal pad tucked beneath one arm. When she saw Jordan, something in her eyes softened, but didn't break. Then she saw Micah. He stood beside the booth, holding the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in the room. The handkerchief was still with him, folded, smoothed, carefully pressed. Gina crouched slowly, her voice low. "You're Micah." He nodded once. She didn't ask him to speak, just looked at the cloth in his hand. "Her son?" she asked gently. He didn't need to answer. His fingers had already curled tighter around it. Jordan slid the laptop across the table. "Everything's in here. Names, routes, timestamps, transfers. That church. It's the eye of the storm." Gina tapped the spacebar. The footage began frame by frame, paper trails and digital echoes unraveling the illusion of a charitable operation. As the images played, her jaw tightened. Her fingers, once calm, began to twitch against the tabletop. The deeper she scrolled, the less she blinked. "Sweet Lord," she whispered. "They buried this." She leaned back slowly, eyes wet but sharp. "This isn't a mistake. It's a cover job, clean hands wrapped around dirty money." Micah drew something on the paper in front of him. A winding road, a building, a figure standing small in the doorway, arms stretched out. He shaded the corners darker than the rest. Gina watched him. "You remember all this?" He nodded again. "Then that's your testimony." Jordan shifted. "You think a judge will even hear it?" "If I file right, yes. If I raise enough dust, someone's gonna look." She pulled out a flash drive, loaded the files without another word, then opened her laptop and began typing fast, hard, as if striking the keys could push back against everything that had led to this. "Petition for retrial," she muttered. "Preliminary motion for evidence review. Citing systemic negligence, witness exclusion, prosecutorial bias." Her voice trailed off as her hands took over. Jordan watched her face harden into the woman he remembered, fierce, unyielding. Not just a lawyer, a storm. Micah kept drawing, eyes narrowed in concentration. He added another line, Elena standing alone, surrounded by shadows. Jordan looked at the image, then at Micah. "She's waiting for us," he said. Micah didn't look up, but his pencil moved faster. That night, the three of them sat in silence beneath the glow of the window. No music, no television, just the quiet breath of a room holding its breath. The morning the file was submitted, a restless wind swept through town. It carried a kind of weight, like the scent of a storm coming, though the skies stayed clear. Jordan pressed send just before dawn, then sat back, heart thudding against his ribs like a warning knock. The petition wasn't just legal paperwork. It was a challenge, a reckoning. Gina hadn't slept. She reread every line 3 times before submitting it to the district review board and local authorities. Names were named, dates corroborated, footage embedded. It left little room for doubt unless someone was determined not to see. They didn't wait long for resistance. When Gina handed the printed report and a USB to the sheriff, he didn't even sit down. He scanned the first few pages, sniffed. "This looks like a conspiracy theory cooked up by teenagers," he muttered. Jordan stood nearby, arms crossed. Then explain the drone footage. Drone, the sheriff scoffed. From a minor, that's not admissible. Doesn't need to be. It's enough to warrant a second look. Gina cut in calm but razor sharp. He was already walking toward the door when she clicked play on her tablet. The drone footage filled the small office with the hiss of rustling trees and the crunch of tires over gravel. A truck backed into the warehouse. Boxes were lifted out, then paused. The sheriff leaned in. 3 men, 2 masked, one in a turned-out volunteer vest, shifted crates from one truck to another. The contents weren't donations. They were unlabeled, wrapped in thick black film. One box burst slightly on impact, revealing a brick-like shape in silver foil. The sheriff straightened. His face didn't show surprise, just the kind of hard stillness that came when a lie wore out. "I'll need a judge," he said quietly. Gina didn't smile. "Then get one." By sunset, the warrant was signed. At 7:32 p.m., the raid began. Jordan and Micah watched from a safe distance, seated low in Gina's parked car near the tree line. Red and blue lights flared against the warehouse's corrugated metal. Officers flooded in with flashlights drawn their steps, heavy and certain. The warehouse gave up its secrets easily. Falsified documents, federal shipping labels, a collection of controlled substances sealed in boxes marked "Books for the Blind." The place was a shrine of betrayal layered in dust and deception. At the center of it all, Pastor Whitmore. He was found in his study at the church, sipping tea and reviewing sermon notes. When the sheriff entered, Whitmore only looked up mildly and said, "Can I help you, son?" He didn't speak again once the cuffs were on. The door to Elena's cell creaked open without ceremony. The officer who escorted her said nothing, just gestured. She stood slowly. Her hair had grown longer, coiled tight around her neck. Her cheeks were hollow skin, dull under the fluorescent light, but her spine remained straight, and her eyes, though sunken, still burned steady. As they led her down the corridor, echoes of her own footsteps seemed foreign. It wasn't until the last door swung wide that her hands trembled. Outside the gate, under a low orange sky, stood Gina. Beside her, Micah in his cleanest shirt, holding that same folded handkerchief in both hands. Elena froze. Then slowly she stepped out. Her eyes scanned their faces, stopping on her son's. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in silence, in knowing. She tried to speak, but nothing came. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her arms lifted. And then she was kneeling, arms wrapped around Micah's waist, her head pressed into his chest, her shoulders shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. A cracking open. A return. Micah held her just as tightly, his fingers weaving into her hair. Gina stepped back, letting the moment hold its full weight. Not a word was spoken, but everyone heard it. In town, the whispers moved like smoke. Those who once crossed the street to avoid Elena now dropped their eyes when she passed. At the diner, Marlene pretended to read receipts that weren't there. The church bulletin board lost its weekly updates. And on Sunday, for the first time in years, the bell didn't ring. The sanctuary remained locked. But in the hush that followed, something else stirred. It wasn't quite vindication. Not yet. But the silence had changed. It no longer crushed. The courthouse loomed like it always had, red brick bleached by sun edges, softened by years of wind and whispered judgment. But that morning, its stillness felt different. Not defiant. Expectant. Gina walked up the front steps with a steady gait, her heels clicking like punctuation. She wore no jewelry, no pretense, just a navy suit and a thin silver pin at her collar. Her briefcase was scuffed, its seams softened by use. but it held everything that mattered: evidence, names, and a story the world had tried to forget. Jordan followed 2 steps behind, shoulders squared, jaw set. He carried the laptop. Backup drives were zipped into his backpack, cables wrapped neatly, tools of a digital vigilante. Micah was already inside, seated in the first row. His shirt had been pressed twice that morning. Gina had done the buttons, smoothing the collar with hands that trembled only slightly. The boy's shoes tapped gently against the bench, nervous, not fearful. He held his mother's handkerchief tucked into his sleeve, fingers brushing it now and then like a secret signal. At exactly 9:04, the judge entered. The courtroom settled into silence, not the awkward kind, but something denser, like breath being held across a whole room. Elena was led in from a side door. She wore a simple gray dress and no jewelry. Her hair, longer now, was tied back in a single braid. She didn't glance around. She looked only forward, her hands folded gently in her lap as she sat at the defendant's table. From her seat, she could see Micah. That was enough. Gina opened the case with the soft rustle of papers and a single breath. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let the evidence speak: timestamps on drone footage, showing illegal transfers, ledger sheets with doctored totals, screenshots of falsified invoices, and the damning trail of funds routed through the church's shell nonprofit to out-of-state accounts. Each slide flashed on the courtroom screen. Each name, each date, each calculated omission was spoken aloud. Jordan sat beside her, nodding her through transitions, occasionally clicking to the next clip or diagram. When Gina paused, it wasn't for effect. It was to let the weight of each truth sink in. The defense attorney for the state tried objections. Twice. But the judge, a man with a salt and pepper mustache and a reputation for caution, waved them off. When Micah was called, no one expected what came next. He didn't take the witness stand Gina had arranged for an exception. Instead, he stood beside the screen holding his sketchbook. With Gina beside him translating his signs, he explained what he saw the night the crates were moved, what the man with the tattoo looked like, what time it was, how his mother had been across town that same hour cooking him dinner and checking his homework. He showed them the drawings, each one layered in charcoal and memory. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. His face never flinched, and in the rows behind him no one whispered. Jordan followed. He explained the data retrieval, how the warehouse traffic logs had been rerouted, how city servers had been mirrored to erase entries after the fact. He walked the court through shell companies' laundering patterns and the manipulation of public charity reports. "You don't need to be a genius to see the pattern," he said. "You just need to care enough to look." Elena watched it all from her seat. Her expression never changed, but her fingers gripped the hem of her skirt tightly, knuckles pale. When it was over, Gina offered no grand conclusion. Just this: "My client has spent weeks in silence, locked away, accused, presumed guilty, not because of what she did, but because she did not speak. Today we have given her voice back. We ask only that you listen." The judge took a full hour in chambers. When he returned, the room tensed. He didn't drag it out. Based on the new evidence, the court finds no grounds to continue charges against Elena Carter. The previous ruling is vacated. Miss Carter is free to go. There was no eruption, no clapping, just a long breath drawn through the entire courtroom. Micah stood. Elena did too. They met halfway. She dropped to her knees, arms wrapped around him so tight the air left her lungs in a ragged sigh. Her face buried in his neck, her shoulders trembling with everything she hadn't been able to say. The road home was quiet. The same red clay, the same crooked oaks lining the shoulder. But to Elena, everything looked altered, like the land itself had taken a long breath and exhaled something softer. She pressed her hand against the window of the car, fingers trailing over the cool glass as the familiar curves of the road passed by. The town she left behind in cuffs was still standing, but something in its bones had shifted. At her doorstep, neighbors stood waiting, people she'd passed in silence for years, who once smiled too tightly or looked through her altogether. Now they lingered like ghosts with open mouths, holding pies, flowers, cards they didn't know how to give. She met them with a steady gaze. No nods of forgiveness, no warmth, just stillness. Her silence wasn't meant to punish, only to remind. Some wounds don't need salt to sting, just memory. She let their apologies drift like dust. What mattered stood beside her, Micah's hand in hers, small but certain, and Gina's presence just behind the quiet shield she'd never asked for but had earned. Inside the house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The curtains were stiff from time, the air unmoved. But Micah walked in like it hadn't changed, heading straight to the bookshelf. He ran his fingers along the spines, whispering names only he and Elena had given to the rows, the brave ones, the quiet heroes, the ones who never got thanked. He placed the handkerchief back in its old drawer. Elena watched him, her eyes soft. She didn't move to unpack. Instead, she knelt beside him, brushing her thumb over his knuckles. Micah looked up, signed slowly. "Are we home now?" She pressed her forehead to his. "Yes." Word spread fast that Jordan's old suspension had been erased. The principal didn't hold a press conference, but the email made its way around. Record cleared due to new exonerating evidence and community service. Jordan didn't react much. He showed up to class with his usual hoodie and half-zipped backpack. He sat in the back, still quiet, still watchful. But the tension in his shoulders had softened. Teachers noticed. So did students. One of them, a girl from debate, handed him a USB drive with a smile. "Thought you might like to help us audit our online voting system." He took it without a word. At home, his desk now held a framed photo, Micah's sketch of the courtroom scene. No words, just Elena standing tall in the center, light around her. Darkness held at bay by 3 small figures. He kept working on his code at night, but now he wasn't hiding anything. Gina returned to her law firm, but her desk stayed untouched most mornings. She spent her time downtown renting a small office space where the paint peeled and the lights buzzed. There, she launched something new, the Shelter Clause, a legal outreach program for women with no voice left. Elena joined not with speeches but with presence. She organized intake forms, sorted supplies, sat with women who shook too hard to speak. They trusted her in ways words couldn't measure. Because she knew the quiet. She'd lived it. And survived. Soon, people began calling her Miss Carter again, not as a suspect, but as a symbol. Not of strength exactly, of endurance, of dignity. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it stayed a while. One evening near dusk, they walked the old road again. The same red dirt softened under their feet. The sun, low and golden, cast long shadows ahead of them. Elena held Micah's hand. Jordan walked on her other side, hands in his pockets, gaze sweeping the horizon as if reading it. No one spoke. There was no need. Micah swung their hands gently, his shoes scuffing dust. The wind rustled the trees. A bird called out unseen. In the silence there was no strain. Just breath, motion, memory. They paused near the bend, the place where it all had cracked open. The road behind them was long, crooked, painful, but the one ahead, uncertain as it was, belonged to them now. And in that stretch of amber light, 3 shadows reached forward, tethered not by words, but by what they'd endured and what they were becoming. A chapter had closed. and a quieter, stronger one had begun. This story leaves a lasting impression through its quiet power and emotional honesty. Elena's journey from wrongful arrest to vindication is not told with dramatic outbursts, but through stillness, resilience, and deep love. Her silence is never emptiness. It's filled with dignity and strength. Micah, though just a child, carries the heart of the story. His determination to speak for his mother without uttering a word reveals the unbreakable bond between them and the quiet heroism children are capable of. Jordan's transformation from a withdrawn teen to a protector of justice shows how pain can become purpose when given the chance. What makes this story so compelling is its realism. There are no superheroes here, only people hurt by a system slowly reclaiming their truth. The most powerful scenes are those with no dialogue, where a gesture, a glance, or a shared silence carries the emotional weight. The story offers a profound human lesson. Real justice is not just about proving innocence, but about being heard, especially for those the world often ignores. It reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks barefoot on red dirt roads, holding a child's hand, refusing to be erased. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.